Okay, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Great, okay. So just moving on a little bit here, because we're covering some of the stuff already. Just a brief disclaimer, you know, cybersecurity is a pretty tricky business. This is high-level guidance, and I guess what I'm really trying to say here is that, you know, you kind of need to validate for yourself what your results are going to be when you try things out. So this is my view, it's not my employer's view. It's kind of an educational thing. And ultimately, should you find yourself responsible for cybersecurity measures, policies, or outcomes, they are your responsibility. So just got to get that in there at the start. So a couple of thoughts, and I just put the slide in here. I mean, it's in one sense almost de rigueur to put in a little bit of material about what's going on in the industry. But I suppose the reason I put this in really was that just to highlight, you know, why it is so important to think about, you know, what your roadmap is from a cybersecurity perspective for your organization, and to have a good mechanism to get after that. And sometimes it's hard to figure out where to start. And I guess that's what I'm going to try and help provide some guidance on today, and some basic structures to think about when you find yourself in that position, hopefully in the near future, and you're thinking about, well, how do I get started on all of this? But there is a lot to consider, and a lot of different threat vectors to consider in particular, and how they pertain to your organization. So I suppose just moving on a little bit. So what is the starting point? And you know, really the goal of having a sort of a plan when it comes to cybersecurity is, you know, thinking about your organization and its needs. And for me, there's kind of 4 areas to think about when you're thinking about where to start with your cybersecurity roadmap. The first thing is your mindset, actually, and approach. And well, it sounds a little bit of a kind of a humorous thing to say, but a healthy paranoia and active engagement with unknown unknowns are key to success. Overconfidence and optimism, not so much. And I think that even for us as a cybersecurity company, in my role, I find myself regularly combating overconfidence and optimism within the organization that, you know, we're fine, we'll be okay, we know enough, we've done enough. The reality is you never know enough, and you've never done enough, so you constantly have to keep pushing forward. Threat-led thinking, so thinking about less about systems and processes, their outcomes that you want to kind of implement, but think about the threats that you're facing and use that as the basis to drive the conversation around what needs to get done. So the threat might be phishing, and well, what do we need to do about that? And I'll actually provide hopefully a useful worked example in a little while on that one. But starting with that, and this kind of comes back to, you know, risk management generally. And the best way to get people's attention on a risk is to essentially talk about it as if it's already happened, right? So starting with a threat and saying, well, imagine if we'd already been phished and we were already the victim of a ransomware attack, or, you know, and we'd failed to patch some software and it become a kind of an entry point for a cyber attack. Those sort of are good ways to get people's attention on the problem or what needs to be done. Prioritize, and this is perhaps the hardest part in some respects, because depending on where you work and the sort of environment you're in and what maturity you're at, you'll find that there may well be an awful lot of things to consider and a lot of priorities. And I think for me, it's very simple really, which is look at the commonality of the threat. How often does it actually occur in the wild? You know, what are the weakest points in your setup today? And I suppose, therefore, what is the largest business impact that any given threat could have to you as an organization or a business? And really building on all that, you know, try not to eat the elephant whole, but pick out, you know, small wins that you can get every few months, and keep building on that and build momentum around your cybersecurity roadmap. That's a really good way to sort of go about it. So what's a model to think about when it comes to building out a threat-driven sort of model for your roadmap? Well, there are 3 domains I think about. Now, there are probably maybe more, depending on what type of business you're in and what type of organization you're in. But certainly for our particular business as a software product company, with, you know, predominantly a software as a service model, there's 3 big ones that we focus on. Our organization, our essentially company, I suppose, assets like our network, systems, devices, stuff like that, vendors that we work with, obviously, and all of that. Data, a really big one. In many respects, it's the portable part of everything that you do as a business. So you have to watch it in a particular type of way. And finally, our product itself, it's a cybersecurity product, which makes it even more attractive for cyber criminals to hack, because it provides a fantastic opportunity for a supply chain attack. So obviously the security of our product is absolutely paramount. So it's its own domain and gets its own attention from our perspective in terms of our roadmap and our consideration from a threat perspective. So a basic assessment model, and this is exactly what we do within TitanHQ, is we take for each of those domains, we decide, well, what are the attack vectors that we're concerned about for that domain, describe them and understand the mechanisms. And it's important to even be complete in that regard, because when you take any given attack vector, there can often be quite a number of ways that can occur, and that in turn reflects into, well, things in your systems and architecture that you have to consider. Looking at the risk, how likely is it to occur, and what would the impact be? What mitigations have you got in place today? So what are you already doing that's good and helping to prevent that thing from actually happening? And of course, the exposures, the things that you're not yet doing that you should do or ideally would do, that would stop that particular attack in its tracks, right? And of course, a plan and next steps is, well, how do we address those exposures? And what score are you aiming for in terms of your assessment of your performance in this area from one iteration to the next, so to speak. So just give a bit of an example. Some organization or company-based vectors that we look at as an example for our particular business from within our organization are things like phishing, malware, and social engineering, physical network access, and so on here. And I could go through them in more detail, and I can pause here if there's questions on any of this, but I suppose the key thing is that this kind of gives you a sense of, for us, when we talked about our company and that particular domain, we settled on these as the attack vectors that we were concerned about. And then we spent quite a bit of effort making certain that we understood collectively what we meant by that in describing them, right? So for phishing, malware, social engineering, we said, well, that's, that can happen through email. It can happen through file attachments. It can happen through URLs. It can happen through a phone or a device. Those are the kind of primary mechanisms that we're interested in as we think about that particular attack vector. And that's essentially applied the whole way through here in terms of how we think about this. So I suppose just to kind of provide an alternate perspective, for our product, there is a little bit of overlap in terms of the attack vectors, but often in our case, they're often quite different. So just again, provide a few examples on that. The DDoS attack, distributed denial of service attack, is actually a fairly big deal for us. And we kind of pretty regularly experience them anyway. So that kind of goes to number one on the list, which is, well, if you've already been attacked before, it's definitely going to happen again. And you want to make certain you're improving your defenses in that regard. Things like supply chain, we use third parties as part of our products. Their security becomes our security. So understanding their level of security in terms of our product becomes quite important as well. Just to pick another example here, or maybe a cluster of examples, code vulnerabilities. If you're writing code, it's the easiest place to introduce vulnerabilities into your product in some respects, because it takes that much more effort to inspect the code and have the right processes in place to ensure that you're scanning your code for potential vulnerabilities, for good coding practices, all those sort of things, and so on. So this is, again, it's an example list. It's just to give you guys an idea of some of the things that we would consider. And of course, the key questions, here on the right-hand side, for you, if your product, in the case of a software product, there certainly is plenty out there to consider, but your product could be different. You could be in a completely different environment. You could be in an education environment. You could be in a university. As unfortunately, NUI Galway recently suffered an attack. Their product is kind of fundamentally different, because their product is educating people. So it's worth thinking about that, and what's the implications for attack vectors on that. Why would you be attacked? What's the opportunity for the cyber criminal? Kind of provides a motivation and maybe even insight into where they might go with that. if you've already been attacked, as I said. And of course, the impact on your customers is pretty key when looking at each of the threat vectors and actually saying, well, if this did happen, what would happen to our customers and how would we deal with that? So I'm kind of charging along here. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if there's any questions that anyone might have.
Just a very quick one there on number 7, sorry, number 8, the DNS exfiltration attack. I'm not sure if I've quite heard of that. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, that's, well, we do provide a product that essentially is a DNS filter, right, and with Titan. So a DNS exfiltration attack is something whereby it's sort of a kind of a backdoor type thing in that essentially leverage the DNS protocol to add additional information to it as a way to exfiltrate. It's basically a data loss issue where you can potentially exfiltrate information from a company without it being going through what is an obvious sort of an information port. Right?
Oh, okay. So it was sort of come out with as sort of with the DNS packet. That makes more sense, yeah. Exactly,
yeah. So from our point of view, that's a kind of a critical one because we're filtering DNS traffic and being paid to do that and to secure that. And a lot of our focus is on categorization. We essentially resolve DNS traffic for companies and then categorize it and obviously apply policies based on that. But there is that aspect of what that, whether that data or the protocol has been leveraged in a way that might be, I suppose, nefarious, I guess, to put it that way.
Sure, yeah, excellent, great, thank you.
No problem. That was the least question I was expecting out of the slide, but it's a really good one to ask. Just to talk about data for a minute, data is kind of, in one sense, the most obvious thing to be aware of, but it's also very challenging for a lot of people to get their arms around. And just sharing an insight into how I tend to think about it and get after it is essentially, we actually are building and sort of pushing a fairly active data strategy for our business anyway, because data is a valuable asset to your company or organization one way or the other. But when you start to think about it that way, of course, above and beyond any GDPR type considerations you might have, there's still more to think about when it comes to data. So a really simple starting point is just to think of the systems that are in your business, right, in your organization, and to think about that inventory. And I've got a sample list here on the side of the page that a typical company might have: HR systems, finance systems for payroll and accounts payable and invoicing, sales, if you're selling stuff, which most organizations invariably do, manage your customers with a CRM system, maybe have subscription management or things like that. Payments sometime in there as well, which is an often extremely dangerous area for companies. My recommendation is find somebody else to provide you with a payment portal and make certain they know what they're doing. But support and marketing and so on. There's loads of things to consider, but starting with the list of systems is a very good way to come up with what is actually your data, because systems and data are essentially synonymous, and one kind of begets the other, so to speak. So that gives you a good way to start to think about, well, the data that's in a given system and what might the concern be there. So again, to pick an example, payroll for finance, would be definitely a GDPR matter if your finance payroll system was breached in some way and the data exfiltrated and made public, right? And I think the HSE breach recently was kind of an example of that. A lot of completely personal and private information for thousands of patients were made kind of public on the dark web. But generally speaking, looking at each of those through the lens of how bad could it get if all that data was made public tomorrow, gives you a sense of where it should sit in terms of your pecking order from the point of view of security. So again, to give an example for us as a company, we look at it all very seriously. To be honest, there's nothing there that we're like saying, yeah, that doesn't matter. I think it's all serious. But in relative terms, product data like our code base is, perhaps the most critical item, because so many downstream impacts could occur if that were exposed, right? So that is the one that gets prioritized first. And then we kind of flow down from there through customer data, our personnel data, finance data, etc. So it's kind of, as it says here, key criteria to assess, thinking about the data, where is it hosted? Is it encrypted at rest, emotion, stuff like that, access controls, who has access, how are you managing that? What would be the impacts of a data breach? I mean, that's a number one item from the point of view of prioritization. And then if that were to happen, have your recovery process in place? And as I kind of mentioned here on the slide as well, depending again on the maturity of the business, there are lots of businesses where security just was not a priority in the purchase of a particular, or selection of a vendor for a particular area. And of course, that can become a very hard problem to resolve at a later stage when you're heavily embedded on the use of a system, but it's not that easy to make it secure. So those are some things to think about there. Pause here, just in case any questions on that before I move on. Okay. So this is just a worked example, right? And I took a really common one, which is phishing, malware, and social engineering for a business, right? And we've already talked about the descriptions of these. The way we did this as a business was we kind of worked through these headings and we took each one and said, well, what's the risk of phishing, malware, or social engineering event happening to our company? And the reality is that it's a high risk for everybody, for every company, everywhere, right? So we scored a 9 out of 10 as well. It's arguably a 10 out of 10 in reality. And what would the worst case look like for our business? Well, I mean, just to, I suppose, articulate that, if someone in our company were to click a link and ultimately introduce ransomware into our business, I mean, without all of the necessary preparations in place, it could take all of our systems down, could result in a lengthy outage for us as a company with enormous impact to financial performance. It could expose data, certainly would damage our brand, all those things. So, saying that all out loud is incredibly good for focusing your mind on what you should do about it. That's, I suppose, the whole point of this process in the first place. So you're taking it from there. So what are your mitigations? And this is an example list of mitigations, which may or may not overlap with some of the things that we're doing within TitanHQ at the moment. But to pick some kind of obvious ones that, I mean, everyone should be doing anyway. So employee phishing training and phishing simulation are kind of, human layer, first line of defense, last line of defense, maybe, in terms of a phishing attack, particularly. Training your staff to, recognize what phishing emails look like, sending them simulations and see who are the phish prone people in your organization, and giving them even more training because that's what they need, because they do represent a significant threat. And on the other hand, having two-factor authentication on all of your systems is what every company should aspire to at a minimum, right? Ideally, it's a that MFA or some form of that combined with single sign-on or SAML or something like that. But those are examples of key measures. And even like, if you're looking at malware, secure email gateway, which we sell, so we're pretty very focused on that from a business perspective anyway. So, but that's just to give an example of, when you're sitting there thinking about, well, where are we at now and what do we need to do next? You kind of need to understand what are your current mitigations versus that attack vector. Then really it's the gaps. And this can be quite hard because you might be feeling really good about what your mitigations are. With any luck, that would be a good place to be. But it's still good to look at where gaps might remain. So maybe not every single system has two-factor authentication. Maybe you want to add SIM or add a SOAR integration. Maybe your backup strategy isn't good enough, right? Your first or second lines of defense might be great, but maybe there's areas where you have to think about, well, what if those fail? How am I sort of fixed to deal with the worst case of having to restore service from a backup, right? So that's where, like, for example, an air gap backup capability is really important, especially for critical data, one that is just impossible to get to from your current network, no matter what privilege escalation takes place, right? And when you take those and you take that across a long list of attack vectors and you take the next steps and the plan around those, you're going to have a really good roadmap, and one that you can review through the exact same framework every 3 to 6 months, and that will really drive you along in terms of how you actually perform as a business from a cybersecurity perspective. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. So this is just I put this together as kind of an example. I mean, it's actually not dissimilar to how I report out on roadmap progress rather within TitanHQ to our board, right? So things like, how do we assess where are we at in terms of our outcomes on company and product security? And I suppose what I probably should have mentioned, I'm just going to go back a slide here, is that on the current mitigations, we score ourselves out of 1 to 10 in terms of how we feel our current mitigations stack up against the threat as presented, right? And that could be, obviously anywhere from 1 to 10. I personally recommend rarely using anything over a 7 or an 8 because that implies overconfidence, would be how I put it. So, it's but being able to demonstrate progress is important in these areas as well. And when you get to your plan, as you can see, it says in the box there, outcome, score, goal, is, well, how much are we going to move the needle with the next set of items in the plan in relation to this attack vector? So just wanted to throw that in there. So when I put this particular slide together, the goal here was really to, I suppose, highlight the, where we were, where we are, and what our plan is, and what our opportunities we've identified to improve, and what target we're going to hit next, and where we think we can get to in terms of our score long term if we were to optimize our performance in each of these areas. And of course, the final item on this, which is worth calling out, is the roadmap and investment. And cybersecurity is it's kind of becoming frankly, I think, an essential investment for every company. When people think about the implications of your business being shut down for a lengthy period of time, it starts to make a lot more sense to think about what are basic capabilities to invest in, just to start to reduce the odds of that actually happening, right? And of course, if any of you are involved in purchasing decisions anytime soon, just feel free to give me a call, and I'll be happy to sort of organize demos of our large suite of security products to help you out with that. Some key questions to think about as you go along with this. Are we 100% secure? The answer to that question is always no, right? And it's always good to answer it in the sense of perfection is impossible. What are the things we should be focused on next? How high is the risk? How well prepared are we? What are the biggest risks right now? And that whole kind of, I suppose, well, it's like the GULP test, but it's really for CISOs and cybersecurity personnel in general, what keeps you up at night? That's the thing you've got to be thinking about all the time. And of course, are you assigning the right resources to work on the highest priority items? That is another area where companies often fall down, which is they've got enough resources, they're just not putting them into the area that represents the greatest threat to their business. So just coming into the end of this, couple of parting thoughts, things to consider as you kind of think about this whole road mapping exercise. Education and awareness. I mean, obviously, you guys are already engaged in your own education, which is fantastic. As you get out into industry and work in this, thinking about all the people that you work with as key stakeholders in cybersecurity is a really good way to think about that, and how to be constantly educating them on the risks and issues in this space. It's a great way to build, frankly, support from that sort of important stakeholder base for cybersecurity strategy. Quantifying the business impact. So when you're looking at those attack vectors and talking about them, as if they'd happened, it's again an absolutely phenomenal way to make it, really real. Well, if this happened, our business generates this amount of revenue every day or every week or every month, and we were out of business, out of operation for 2 months. Well, that's what it would cost to our business, leaving aside any reputational or other damage, right? The visibility, so critical, can't be in a back room, it needs to be front and center. And that's probably why, phishing simulation and anti-phishing training are so important, because they raise awareness generally across every single member employee of a company. So again, another kind of key area of focus. Ownership, security is everyone's responsibility. And one of the great sort of case studies that I love in this area was, it was actually one of the threat vectors I identified earlier on around sort of physical access. Just the humble USB key, right? A particular University of Michigan rather, they dropped about 300 USB keys around their campus, and the vast majority were picked up, and more than half were inserted without any measures taken to protect the individual into someone's laptop. So when you think about it in those terms, cybersecurity professionals should be regularly sprinkling USB keys around the office to see who picks them up and does something with them. But even more importantly, have you taken all the measures? Have you shut down USB access on all of your laptops, for example? That's things like that to consider. And I suppose the final point I'd remember, is it sounds like a bit of a joke, but paranoia in the space is really a superpower. It's important to be looking out for everything and anything that can represent a threat. Most people just aren't that way oriented. So in some respects, that's what makes working in this industry particularly difficult, is you're kind of there to help protect everyone else from their own relative benign optimism around things, and hopefully ensure that things don't go wrong. So wrapping up there and heading to questions. The threats are real. Just ransomware alone is an absolute epidemic at this stage. There's like, I don't know, an attack every few minutes or something like that. It's absolutely insane how much of this is going on. But it certainly is an example of, I suppose, the reason I put this in was that if you're struggling for information to share with stakeholders, just Google it. You'll get millions of hits on this stuff and tons of case studies, and there's just any amount of information out there on this that you can leverage, loads to use there. So I'm going to